property rights violation and nuisance establishment, excerpt. This section documents the initial phase of the Pinewood Gardens dispute, focusing on the sustained, deliberate violation of the homeowners, Marcus Holloway's, fundamental right to quiet enjoyment and the administrative failure that allowed a local governance officer to utilize harassment tactics with impunity. Introduction. The challenge to property tenure and quiet enjoyment. The Pinewood Gardens incident serves as a critical case study illustrating the vulnerability of private property rights within residential subdivisions overseen by local administrative structures. The conflict originated not from a complex legal infraction, but from a basic act of malicious noncompliance and administrative abuse targeting a homeowner's waste receptacle. This event quickly escalated into a sustained campaign of intentional property damage and psychological nuisance. For the purpose of USDA policy analysis concerning rural housing integrity, this phase underscores how unchecked individual authority within governance can systematically erode the legally protected right to quiet enjoyment, compelling the homeowner to seek unconventional methods of defense when institutional redress fails. Analysis of sustained physical harassment and deliberate property damage. The governance officer, a designated compliance official within the administrative structure, engaged in a clear and repetitive pattern of physical harassment against the homeowner's assets. Patterned repetitive collisions. Documentation confirmed approximately 57 recorded incidents where the officer's private vehicle was intentionally used to collide with the homeowner's waste receptacle. The consistency in timing, early morning, and location established a clear intent of malicious repetition designed to inflict maximum disruption. Creation of public nuisance. Each collision resulted in the spillage of refuse onto the property and surrounding public easement. This not only created a direct physical nuisance for the homeowner, documented financial cost of $92 in replacements cleanup, but also provided the officer with the perverse leverage to issue subsequent administrative notices and fines against the homeowner for improper refuse containment. Violation of basic property peace. The repetitive and loud impacts, particularly during hours dedicated to rest, constituted a profound breach of the homeowner's legally recognized right to quiet enjoyment. This type of harassment, though seemingly minor in isolation, represented a sustained psychological imposition designed to intimidate and coerce. Abuse of administrative authority and arbitrary coercion. The physical harassment was systematically supported by the officer's abuse of her compliance role within the local administrative structure. Issuance of arbitrary fines. Despite being the direct cause of the property disarray, the officer issued the homeowner daily fines of $50 for the ensuing mess. A legal review confirmed these fines were based on a subjective interpretation of vague covenants and lacked clear regulatory foundation, demonstrating the use of administrative power for extortion and coercion. Conflict of administrative roles. The core failure lay in the officer's simultaneous ability to perpetrate the nuisance and then administer the penalty. This profound conflict in administrative roles highlights the critical lack of ethical separation of powers and checks within the local structure. The intent to suppress. The combined strategy of physical damage and arbitrary financial penalty was designed to create an untenable living environment for the homeowner, forcing compliance with the officer's non-standard demands or driving the homeowner from the property, thereby suppressing dissent against the administrative authority. Administrative oversight failure and regulatory vulnerability. The persistence of the harassment demonstrated a fundamental failure in the administrative structure's capacity for self-regulation and external oversight. Internal governance paralysis. The higher governing body, the full board, failed to intervene or sanction the officer, indicating either a lack of internal authority, fear of confrontation, or institutional paralysis. This failure allowed the personal misconduct to become an unaddressed governance liability. Exploitation of covenants. The officer capitalized on the ambiguity in the local covenants regarding the specific material and structural integrity of waste receptacles. This regulatory void allowed for the arbitrary imposition of personal preferences disguised as official compliance standards. Policy imperative. This incident establishes a clear policy imperative for state and federal oversight agencies to mandate external auditing of local administrative structures, particularly when persistent complaints of administrative abuse and property rights violations are documented. Regulatory loopholes and administrative failures, excerpt. This section conducts a detailed, policy-focused analysis of the systemic vulnerabilities and jurisdictional ambiguities within the local governance framework that enabled the escalation of the harassment documented in Section 1. It highlights the critical failure points where state and federal oversight of residential governance must be enhanced to protect property rights, secure resident tenure, and prevent administrative malfeasance within rural and suburban developments. The structural deficiencies in governance covenants and statutes. The Pinewood Gardens dispute serves as a foundational example of a governance crisis enabled by structural deficiencies in the local administrative body's foundational documents and the subsequent failure of state statutes to mandate adequate oversight. This lack of robust regulatory infrastructure creates statutory gaps which can be systematically exploited by individuals in positions of authority for personal gain or vendetta. The central administrative failure was the absence of internal mechanisms to effectively address a clear breach of fiduciary responsibility by a board-affiliated officer, thereby allowing a personal dispute to metastasize into a community liability. Jurisdictional ambiguity of public right-of-way and nuisance law. The initial flashpoint of the conflict, the placement of the waste receptacle, was rooted in a significant jurisdictional ambiguity concerning the public right-of-way, a common problem in planned residential developments. Conflicting regulatory hierarchy, the homeowner's action was in direct compliance with the municipal health ordinance, which required trash placement within 3 feet of the curb for collection, yet was simultaneously declared a violation by the local administrative officer under subjective community aesthetic covenants and restrictions, C&RS. This inherent conflict highlights a failure in state law to clearly define the subordination of private covenants to superior public health and safety mandates. Weaponization of subjectivity. The administrative officer exploited the subjective nature of the C&RS, transforming vague language regarding aesthetics and traffic flow into a regulatory weapon. Policy reform must mandate that aesthetic compliance rules cannot supersede or contradict superior regulations related to public utility access or safety standards. Recommendation for USDA compliance. For all residential projects benefiting from USDA rural housing programs, policy must require a legal audit confirming that local C&RS explicitly subordinate their enforcement power to all municipal, county, and state laws concerning infrastructure, public health, and utility access, eliminating this zone of ambiguity. Failure of internal ethics and non-partisan grievance mechanisms. A critical administrative failure was the complete absence of an effective, impartial internal process for the homeowner to seek redress against the abusive officer. Lack of independent review mandate. The governing document lacked a provision for a mandated, impartial ethics or grievance committee capable of investigating and adjudicating complaints against elected or appointed administrative officials. This forced the homeowner to submit complaints directly to the full governing board, which was compromised by its association and potential complicity with the aggressive officer. Erosion of fiduciary duty. The governing board failed in its fundamental fiduciary duty to the community by refusing to investigate and mitigate the known pattern of harassment by one of its appointed agents. This inaction exposed the entire administrative body to subsequent civil liability and allowed the continued financial malfeasance, further detailed in Section 5. Policy gap in accountability. Current state regulations often set an excessively high statutory threshold for the removal of a board member, typically requiring proof of gross malfeasance or criminal conviction. This effectively shields abusive administrative officials from accountability for non-criminal, but highly destructive, acts of harassment, enabling the protracted abuse seen in this case. Deficiencies in mandatory financial transparency and disclosure. The long-term enabling factor for the financial fraud, which the harassment was meant to conceal, was the laxity in state-level requirements for financial transparency and conflict of interest disclosure in local governance. Reliance on self-reporting. State law relied heavily on self-reporting of financial conflicts of interest by administrative board members. This system is inherently flawed, as demonstrated by the officer's success in concealing her ownership in an outside construction firm that received lucrative contracts from the governing body. Absence of external audit mandate. The local administrative body was not subject to a mandatory external financial audit unless requested by a supermajority of members, a threshold difficult to meet when the governing body actively suppresses information. This regulatory gap allowed the systematic funneling of community funds for personal profit. Implication for USDA rural development. To safeguard federal funds and residential stability, future USDA policy must advocate for or mandate that all affiliated local administrative bodies implement proactive external financial oversight and a zero-tolerance policy for undisclosed financial interests in vendor contracts. The failure to disclose must automatically trigger a governance review and legal action to recover community funds. Engineering-based property defense strategy, excerpt. This section analyzes the homeowner's, Mr. Holloway's, strategic, non-violent counteraction, the construction of a structurally reinforced waste receptacle, as a pragmatic engineering response to sustained, repetitive physical harassment. It evaluates how this innovative, rule-compliant defense strategy neutralized the physical nuisance, definitively documented the aggressor's malicious intent, and provided the necessary evidence to escalate the dispute beyond simple property damage to criminal action. Introduction: Innovation in property defense against administrative nuisance. The persistence of the administrative officer's physical harassment, Section 1, and the failure of the regulatory framework to provide timely internal redress, Section 2, necessitated an innovative and strategic defense by the homeowner. The goal was to develop a countermeasure that operated entirely within the limits of existing public codes and community covenants, yet physically nullified the officer's harassing tactic. This section examines the technical and legal rationale behind the construction of the reinforced receptacle, highlighting its efficacy in transitioning the dispute from a civil matter of property maintenance to a case of documented malicious intent and potential vehicular assault insurance fraud. Technical design and compliance rationale. The design of the counter-receptacle was specifically engineered to be structurally impervious to the repetitive, low-speed vehicular impact while maintaining external compliance with all relevant municipal and administrative appearance standards. Structural engineering. The original plastic receptacle was replaced with a structure internally reinforced with 60-pound steel-reinforced concrete and rebar. This design significantly increased the structure's mass and rigidity, ensuring a high moment of inertia. This strategic mass ensured that the force of impact would be primarily transferred back to the impacting vehicle, rather than causing the receptacle to collapse and scatter refuse. Regulatory adherence. The homeowner performed critical due diligence by confirming that all relevant municipal health codes and the local administrative covenants, C&RS, had no restrictions on the material composition of the waste receptacle, e.g., plastic, metal, or concrete. This confirmed the countermeasure was legally compliant, exploiting a regulatory loophole, Section 2. Aesthetic camouflage. The exterior of the reinforced structure was carefully painted and molded to visually mimic the standard, fragile plastic receptacles used throughout the community. This camouflage was a tactical component, ensuring the administrative officer, relying on past experience, would proceed with the collision, believing the expected outcome, destruction and fine-worthy refuse scatter, would occur. Execution and documentation of malicious intent. The deployment of the reinforced receptacle immediately and permanently ceased the physical harassment's intended outcome while simultaneously documenting the officer's refusal to halt the malicious action. The first collision and damage transfer. The collision occurred as scheduled. Due to the high rigidity of the concrete mass, the kinetic energy was immediately transferred back to the aggressor's vehicle, estimated at a 15 miles per hour impact. The result was significant, documented damage to the officer's vehicle, e.g., crumpled running board, while the reinforced receptacle remained intact. Cessation of primary nuisance. The physical nuisance, the repetitive collapse of the receptacle and subsequent refuse scatter, ceased immediately. This neutralized the officer's primary tactic for issuing administrative violation notices against the homeowner, effectively rendering the compliance officer's immediate administrative power ineffective. Documentation of intent. The governance officer, driven by frustration and a refusal to acknowledge the failed tactic, subsequently repeated the collision multiple times. Each documented impact further exacerbated the damage to her vehicle, exceeding $800 in total documented damage. This repetitive, self-destructive action provided irrefutable video and photographic evidence of sustained malicious intent to destroy private property, even when it directly resulted in personal financial loss. Policy implications of rule-compliant defense. This engineering solution serves as a critical model for property owners facing persistent administrative nuisance. Empowering the homeowner, it demonstrates that innovative, rule-compliant defense mechanisms can successfully neutralize governance abuse when regulatory frameworks fail to provide timely protection. Shifting liability. The action effectively shifted the liability for physical damage from the victim, Mr. Holloway, to the aggressor, the administrative officer, ultimately enabling charges for insurance fraud, as the officer could not report the cause of the vehicle damage honestly. Need for specific covenants. The effectiveness of the concrete can defense highlights the need for local governance structures to implement specific, non-subjective covenants, Section 2, that clearly define the structural and material requirements for all exterior residential fixtures, preventing similar exploits of ambiguity in the future. Escalation and documentation of harassment, excerpt. This section details the critical transition in the dispute following the homeowner's successful engineering-based defense, Section 3. It analyzes the governance officer's desperate escalation of tactics, the homeowner's meticulous evidence collection that exposed the deeper financial corruption, and the regulatory significance of documenting persistent, malicious intent. Introduction. The shift from nuisance to financial investigation. The success of the structurally reinforced waste receptacle permanently ended the officer's primary tactic for creating a finable nuisance, Section 3. This tactical failure, however, triggered a desperate and hostile escalation of non-physical harassment, including malicious surveillance and slander. Crucially, the persistence of the officer's personal vendetta, even after incurring personal vehicle damage, signaled that the conflict was motivated by something deeper than compliance, the need to suppress the homeowner or distract from her own governance irregularities. This phase necessitated a strategic pivot in the homeowner's efforts, from property defense to a detailed, forensic investigation of the local administrative structure's financial records and the officer's professional affiliations. Escalation of non-physical coercion tactics. After the physical harassment tactic failed, the administrative officer intensified non-physical forms of psychological coercion and administrative abuse. Malicious surveillance. The officer and her affiliates intensified continuous, overt surveillance of the homeowner's property and activities. This systematic monitoring was intended to create an environment of extreme psychological stress and intrusion upon the homeowner's privacy and right to quiet enjoyment, Section 1. Administrative retaliation. The officer continued to utilize her administrative access to file baseless and repetitive violation complaints for minor or fabricated infractions, e.g., alleged lawn height violations, unapproved exterior colors, despite the homeowner's impeccable compliance record. These were designed to overwhelm the homeowner with administrative bureaucracy. Slander and community ostracization. The officer engaged in a sustained campaign of slander and misinformation within the community, attempting to portray the homeowner as a disruptive litigant. This tactic aimed to isolate the homeowner and undermine his credibility should he attempt to bring his governance concerns to the wider residential body. Meticulous documentation of malicious intent. The homeowner's most critical action during this phase was the meticulous documentation of the persistent harassment and the resulting financial damage. Video and photographic evidence log. Utilizing video cameras and detailed photo logs, the homeowner systematically documented 47 separate incidents of the officer's harassment, including the continued repetition of the vehicle collisions even after the officer's car was damaged. This demonstrated a sustained pattern of malicious intent, which is essential for escalating civil suits to claims of stalking and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Documentation of self-inflicted damage. The evidence captured the financial consequences borne by the administrative officer, over $800 in damage to her private vehicle. This documentation was later crucial in supporting charges of insurance fraud when the officer inevitably filed a fraudulent claim for the vehicular damage. Regulatory significance. For oversight bodies like the USDA, the meticulous record-keeping provides a blueprint for how individual property owners can effectively combat abuse. It demonstrates that sustained, documented evidence of patterns of misconduct is necessary to overcome the inertia of regulatory failure, Section 2. The pivot to financial and governance integrity investigation. The persistent, irrational nature of the harassment led the homeowner to conclude that the officer's motives extended beyond a petty property dispute, necessitating an inquiry into the administrative structure's financial integrity. Search for underlying motive. Recognizing that the officer was willing to damage her own property and risk criminal exposure to harass him, the homeowner initiated a comprehensive search of public records pertaining to the local administrative structure's financial disclosures and vendor contracts. Investigative focus on fiduciary duty. The investigation was strategically focused on potential conflicts of interest and breaches of fiduciary duty, areas commonly exploited in localized governance bodies lacking external oversight. The search focused on procurement processes, vendor affiliations, and the legal ownership of companies receiving maintenance contracts from the administrative body. Precursor to embezzlement discovery, this meticulous public records investigation ultimately served as the necessary precursor to the discovery of the officer's secret ownership in a construction company and the subsequent exposure of systematic self-dealing and embezzlement, detailed in Section 5. This proved that the harassment was likely an effort to suppress a key dissenting homeowner, Mr. Holloway, who posed a threat to the officer's criminal financial scheme. Fiduciary abuse and conflict of interest exposure, excerpt. This section details the critical discovery of systematic financial malfeasance within the local administrative structure, revealing the true motive behind the governance officer's persistent personal harassment, Section 4. It analyzes the profound breach of fiduciary duty, the establishment of an undisclosed conflict of interest, and the subsequent systematic misappropriation of community funds through self-dealing contracts. Introduction: the financial root of administrative harassment. The continued, irrational hostility exhibited by the governance officer, even at the expense of her own property, Section 3, provided the critical signal that the conflict was not rooted in property aesthetics but in the need to suppress oversight of a larger financial scheme. The subsequent forensic review of public records confirmed this hypothesis. This section demonstrates how the absence of mandatory, routine financial audits and the reliance on self-reporting of conflicts allowed a governance official to systematically defraud the community, transforming a position of public trust into an instrument of personal enrichment and financial crime. Discovery of undisclosed financial affiliation. The homeowner's targeted investigation of vendor procurement records and state business registries successfully uncovered the concealed financial link. Corporate ownership confirmation. Public record searches confirmed that the governance officer held a significant ownership stake, documented as 40%, in an externally registered company, identified as a local contracting firm. This established a direct and undeniable financial affiliation between the administrative officer and a vendor company. Concealment of conflict. The officer had deliberately failed to disclose this ownership stake to the local administrative structure, violating the fundamental ethical and legal requirement for conflict of interest disclosure. This act of concealment was a necessary prerequisite for the subsequent financial abuse. Strategic timing. The formation of the officer's private firm was temporally aligned with the escalation of harassment against the homeowner. This proximity strongly suggests that the harassment was initiated to neutralize a vocal and organized homeowner who posed a potential threat to the officer's nascent financial scheme. Systematic self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. The discovery of the officer's affiliation led directly to the exposure of systematic self-dealing that constituted a profound breach of fiduciary duty. Undue contract awards. Documentation proved that the officer, leveraging her influence and voting power within the local administrative structure, successfully steered 7 maintenance and repair contracts, totaling over $23,400 in a single year, to her family-owned contracting firm. Absence of fair competition. These contracts were awarded without demonstrable competitive bidding processes or independent verification of costs, violating established best practices for public procurement in governance structures. In some cases, the officer's firm strategically underbid competitors by marginal amounts, suggesting an inherent knowledge of the bidding process and an intent to guarantee selection. Violation of state non-profit law. By voting to approve contracts that directly benefited her own undisclosed financial interest, the officer violated state-level non-profit corporation laws governing the ethical conduct and fiduciary responsibilities of administrative board members. This exposed the entire community structure to severe legal liability. Financial classification, embezzlement and misappropriation. The systematic financial manipulation must be legally and ethically classified as outright financial crime. Misappropriation of community funds. The funds collected from mandatory resident fees and assessments, community dues, were systematically misappropriated for the private gain of the officer and her family firm. The recovered financial loss was estimated to exceed $47,000 over the period of the scheme. Embezzlement classification. The action falls under the definition of embezzlement, the fraudulent appropriation of funds entrusted to one's care but owned by another. The officer converted community assets, for which she held a position of trust, into private profit. Policy implications for financial integrity. This episode serves as an unequivocal demonstration of the high risk inherent in decentralized governance structures that lack mandatory external review. Policy must recognize that a failure to mandate transparent financial processes directly enables systematic theft and jeopardizes the financial stability of residential communities. The exposure of this financial scheme provided the crucial legal and moral high ground for the homeowner, confirming that the harassment was a secondary tactic used to suppress the evidence of the primary crime, the systematic theft of community resources. Legal resolution, criminal accountability, and restitution, excerpt. This section documents the climactic resolution of the Pinewood Gardens dispute, focusing on the strategic public disclosure of the financial malfeasance, the subsequent criminal enforcement against the former administrative officer, and the successful recovery and restitution of misappropriated community funds. This outcome serves as a critical model for achieving accountability and financial integrity in local residential governance structures. Introduction: The triumph of evidence and transparency. The resolution of the dispute was achieved not through prolonged civil litigation, but through a strategic deployment of irrefutable evidence accumulated by the homeowner, Section 5. The transition from a civil property nuisance case to a criminal financial integrity case necessitated a public forum to restore community trust and ensure the accountability of the governance officer. The primary objectives of this phase were to 1. Secure the immediate removal and criminal prosecution of the abusive official, 2. Recover the funds misappropriated through self-dealing contracts, and 3. Establish a clear legal precedent validating the homeowner's right to defend against administrative corruption. The Public Accountability Forum and Confrontation. The final resolution was triggered during a mandatory, highly attended community meeting, maximizing transparency and public awareness. The unified presentation of evidence. The homeowner, Mr. Holloway, presented a detailed, evidence-based report to the 118 residents present, meticulously linking the malicious personal harassment, Section 1, 3, 4, to the underlying financial crime. The presentation utilized the documented evidence of the concrete defense and the official public records confirming the conflict of interest, Section 5. Disclosure of financial fraud. The core of the presentation was the revelation that the former officer had used her administrative position to award 7 maintenance contracts to her family-owned firm, resulting in $47,000 in calculated embezzlement of community assessment fees. This financial disclosure immediately shifted the community's focus from the petty trash can dispute to the catastrophic loss of communal funds. Immediate governance breakdown. The irrefutable evidence caused an immediate collapse of support for the officer within the administrative structure. The presiding members of the governing body were left with no choice but to acknowledge the severe ethical and legal breaches. Criminal enforcement and judicial action. The comprehensive evidence package, including the self-inflicted vehicular damage and the documented financial fraud, allowed for swift criminal enforcement. Warrant service at public meeting. Law enforcement, having prepared warrants based on the homeowner's evidence, entered the community meeting. The governance officer was publicly arrested and handcuffed on charges including stalking harassment, based on the repetitive nature of the collisions and surveillance, and insurance fraud, related to the damage to her private vehicle caused by the reinforced receptacle. Criminal charges for financial misconduct, subsequent prosecution, informed by the homeowner's forensic work, Section 5, resulted in charges for embezzlement and misappropriation of funds, leveraging state statutes governing fiduciary responsibilities within administrative bodies. Suspension and disqualification. The officer was immediately suspended from her compliance role and permanently disqualified from holding any future elected or appointed position within the local administrative structure. This decisive action was crucial for stabilizing the local governance structure. Financial restitution and community reparation. A fundamental outcome of the resolution was the successful recovery and fair restitution of the misappropriated funds to the community members. Recovery of embezzled funds. Through legal action, the full embezzled amount of $47,000 was recovered from the officer and her related firm. This demonstrated the enforceability of fiduciary statutes even in localized governance disputes. Direct community refund. The recovered funds were proportionally distributed back to every homeowner in the subdivision. Each of the 118 homeowners received a refund estimated at $370, directly repairing the financial damage caused by the corruption. This act of direct restitution was vital in rebuilding trust between the residents and the governance structure. Homeowner settlement and recognition. Mr. Holloway received a settlement covering his legal fees and property damage. Furthermore, the strategic, rule-compliant defense, the reinforced receptacle, was recognized as a symbol of property rights protection. It was preserved and placed on permanent display in the community center, complete with a commemorative plaque, signifying its legacy in the defense against administrative overreach. This resolution provides a clear operational model for USDA policy advocating for the swift prosecution of governance abuses, the mandatory recovery of community funds, and the validation of private citizens who strategically oppose administrative corruption. Policy implications for local governance integrity, excerpt. This final section synthesizes the critical policy lessons derived from the Pinewood Gardens dispute. It presents specific legislative and administrative reforms necessary for strengthening local administrative structures, mitigating the risks of fiduciary abuse and self-dealing, and ensuring the long-term protection of property rights and financial integrity in rural and suburban residential developments. Conclusion: the mandate for proactive governance auditing. The Pinewood Gardens incident serves as a definitive model of how the unchecked power of a single individual within a decentralized governance structure can lead to systemic abuse, criminal activity, and financial losses for the entire community. While the resolution secured criminal accountability and restitution, Section 6, the underlying systemic vulnerabilities, particularly the failure to mandate external oversight and conflict disclosure, remain widespread. This case creates a clear mandate for state and federal regulatory bodies, including those under the USDA's purview concerning rural housing and community development, to transition from a reactive model of addressing fraud after it occurs to a proactive model of mandatory governance auditing and ethical compliance enforcement. Mandatory financial transparency and conflict disclosure reform. The primary enabler of the embezzlement, Section 5, was the reliance on self-reporting of conflicts of interest. Policy must mandate stringent, verifiable disclosure processes. Mandatory external financial audits. State statutes must be amended to require mandatory, annual external financial audits for any local administrative body that manages community funds exceeding a fixed annual budget threshold, e.g., $100,000. These audits must specifically review procurement processes and vendor affiliations to flag potential self-dealing. Mandatory third-party disclosure verification. All board members and appointed officers must be legally required to submit a certified list of all related business interests. This list must be independently verified against public business registries before any contract approval, preventing the concealment demonstrated in this case. Zero-tolerance policy for non-disclosure. A clear, statutory penalty must be established whereby the failure to disclose a material financial conflict automatically triggers immediate removal from office, mandatory forfeiture of all related profits, and criminal investigation, regardless of the contract's perceived fairness. Strengthening administrative accountability and grievance pathways. The lack of an effective internal mechanism to address harassment, Section 2, allowed the abuse to continue and escalate. Reforms must address this governance paralysis. Mandated independent ethics committees. State statutes must require all significant local administrative bodies to establish an independent ethics committee composed of non-board members or externally appointed experts to review and adjudicate complaints against board members and administrative officers. This ensures impartiality in the grievance process. Streamlined judicial recourse. The legal threshold for homeowners to petition a court for the removal of an abusive administrative official must be lowered from criminal conviction to documented evidence of sustained, malicious harassment or clear breach of fiduciary duty. This empowers homeowners to seek timely relief. Mandatory governance training. New policy must require all individuals elected or appointed to administrative roles to complete annual state-certified training in fiduciary responsibilities, ethics, and non-discriminatory enforcement practices, with compliance tracking managed by a state oversight body. Property rights defense and regulatory clarity. The concrete can defense, Section 3, exposed critical ambiguities in regulatory hierarchy that must be clarified. Clarity on public-private jurisdictional hierarchy. State law must clearly define that municipal health and safety ordinances, e.g., waste disposal, fire safety, always supersede subjective aesthetic and structural rules defined in local administrative covenants. This eliminates the gray area exploited by the officer. Standardization of covenants. State regulatory bodies should provide standardized, non-ambiguous language for common covenants to prevent subjective interpretation, particularly concerning property fixtures, where the absence of material specification allowed the strategic defense to be both legally compliant and physically effective. Legacy of property defense. The preservation of the symbolic, reinforced receptacle, Section 6, should be used in policy advocacy as a compelling example of the citizen's right to strategically defend their property against malicious administrative overreach when institutional safeguards fail. This analysis concludes that future policy must prioritize transparency, external audit requirements, and ethical training to ensure that local administrative structures operate with the integrity necessary to secure both the financial stability and the property rights of their resident communities.